Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a grey and windless morning in late October that I first heard of the murder at Hatherbridge Square. A case so bizarre, so irreconcilably contradictory, that even now, years later, it sends a chill along my spine when I recall the details. Holmes and I were still residing at 221B Baker Street, and though the fog of autumn had crept steadily through the streets of London, it was the silence that clung thickest that morning. A silence shattered not by thunder or violence, but by the absence of sound where sound ought to have been. The morning papers were curiously bereft of sensation. Holmes was in one of his idle moods, pacing the room barefoot and pipeless, which was always a dangerous sign. He had spent the previous evening performing experiments on the acoustic resonance of a violin string, and now wore the expression of a mind suffering from understimulation. I was immersed in the Times crossword when a sharp knock came at the door, twice in quick succession, followed by a pause, then a third rap, deliberately spaced. "Scotland Yard," Holmes said without glancing toward the door. "Lestrade, by the tempo." He was correct, of course. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson opened the door and ushered in none other than Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his coat soaked and boots leaving wet prints across the floor. He looked unusually agitated, though he tried to compose himself in the presence of Holmes. "You've heard of the affair at Hatherbridge Square?" Lestrade asked without preamble. "I have not," Holmes replied, taking his seat with a sudden sharpness that I recognised well. "But I surmise that it involves a firearm, 2 men, a locked room, and a single bullet." Lestrade blinked. Yes. But how on earth—" "Come, Inspector," Holmes waved him off gently. "Your coat sleeve bears gunpowder residue. Your boots are marked with clay common to the north-facing garden paths in Mayfair. Your tone indicates urgency, but not danger, so the suspect is not at large. That leaves a riddle, not a hunt. Now, tell me precisely what was found." Lestrade, now thoroughly outpaced and nonetheless obliged. "At 2:30 this morning, the night constable on patrol heard a single gunshot ring out from number 6, Hatherbridge Square. He rushed to the premises, a grand townhouse, 3 stories, occupied by a Mr. Percival Haythorne and his business partner, Elias Rowe. They had returned from Paris only yesterday." He paused, glancing at Holmes. "When the constable arrived, he found the front door unlocked but the drawing-room barred from the inside. When we forced entry, we found Haythorne dead, shot clean through the heart. Rowe was unconscious on the carpet, no sign of struggle. Here is where it gets peculiar." "Please," Holmes murmured, steepling his fingers. "Do go on." "There were 2 shots fired from the same revolver, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said. 2 cartridges spent. 1 bullet was found in Haythorne, the other nowhere. No blood, no hole in the wall, no sign of a second target. And yet—" He paused again, clearly disturbed. "The housekeeper, who had been asleep on the upper floor, swears she heard 1 gunshot, not 2. There was a long silence. Holmes closed his eyes and leaned back, breathing as though savouring the flavour of a rare wine. 2 bullets fired, but only 1 heard," he murmured. "Fascinating." Lestrade pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Rowe is still unconscious. Doctor says it's a fainting spell or trauma. No sign of poison or injury. The revolver was found in his hand, but no powder marks, and there were only 2 men in the room. No signs of forced entry or departure." I leaned forward. "Could it have been suicide?" "Suicide?" Lestrade scoffed. "Haythorne was shot through the heart from a distance of 5 feet, and the door was locked from the inside." Holmes's eyes flicked open. "Ah," he said, "an impossible crime." "Exactly," Lestrade said, the relief audible in his voice. "Impossible, and that's why I came straight to you." Holmes rose, reached for his coat and walking stick, and turned to me. "Watson," he said, "grab your medical bag and your revolver. We're going to investigate the sound that wasn't made." Chapter 2. The arrival at Hatherbridge Square. We rode in silence through the muffled streets of London, the early autumn fog curling in ghostly spirals round the wheels of our hansom cab. Holmes sat opposite me, his expression distant but not idle, eyes half-lidded, fingers twitching faintly as though playing some invisible instrument of thought. It was a silence I had come to know well, not one of peace, but of intricate, silent calculation. I, for my part, was occupied with a flurry of questions that, even in their disorder, refused to align themselves into any comprehensible shape. 2 men, a locked room, 2 shots, and only 1 sound. There was a peculiar chill in the air that morning, and it wasn't entirely due to the season. When at last we arrived at number 6 Hatherbridge Square, we were met by a young constable at the gate who, upon seeing Holmes, straightened with a mixture of dread and relief. The townhouse loomed ahead of us, 3 stories of pale stone partially obscured by creeping ivy and the thick mist. The curtains of the drawing-room on the first floor were closed tight, but a single gas lamp glowed faintly within. Lestrade was already inside. He met us at the door, his face tight with anticipation. "Dr. Rowe still hasn't regained full consciousness. We've posted a man in the hallway outside his room per your instructions, Holmes." Holmes merely nodded. "I'll see the body first." The drawing-room was exactly as Lestrade had described, elegant without being ostentatious, with leather chairs and dark wooden panelling that gleamed dully in the lamplight. And there beside the fireplace lay the body of Percival Haythorne. He was a man in his late 40s, well-dressed and fair-haired, his limbs sprawled in an ungainly pose that belied the quiet dignity of the room. His eyes were open, staring as though interrupted mid-thought. The wound was clean, just above the left breast. No powder burns, no soot. Holmes crouched low beside the body, his fingers fluttering briefly above the man's lapel before withdrawing. "The revolver?" he asked. Lestrade handed it over. 6-chambered Webley, 2 spent cartridges, 4 live. Found in Rowe's hand, but no powder burns or bruising. Holmes turned the weapon over in his hand, sniffed the barrel, then walked slowly to the centre of the room. He paused there, eyes narrowing as he scanned the floorboards. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "describe this scene to me as you see it." I cleared my throat. "It's a drawing room, well kept. The fire had been burning earlier, judging by the faint warmth from the grate. There are 2 glasses on the sideboard. Brandy, I'd wager. Signs of a shared drink. The room has 1 entrance, and that door was locked from the inside when the constable arrived. No open windows, no sign of struggle, no visible place where a second bullet could have gone." "Precisely," Holmes said softly, "and yet one did." He paced the perimeter of the room in silence, pausing once by a portrait of a young woman over the hearth. His eyes lingered on it briefly, but he said nothing. "Was Rowe searched?" he asked. Lestrade nodded. "Only the revolver. No papers, no other weapons. His clothes were damp from sweat. He fainted before the constable could question him." "Has the housekeeper been questioned?" "Yes. Mrs. Whitcomb, elderly woman. Said she heard a shot, just one, and then nothing. She assumed it was street noise until the police arrived." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, examine Rowe, if you please. I want your personal opinion. We found Elias Rowe in the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor, under the care of a sullen-faced constable and a weary nurse. He was a tall man, narrow of face and pale of skin, with a shadow of stubble across his jaw. Though still unconscious, his breathing was steady, and I found no trace of head trauma or illness. It was, as Lestrade had said, more like a faint than any deeper malady. No signs of injury, I confirmed. Likely shock, perhaps induced by emotional or psychological strain. He should awaken soon. Back in the drawing-room, Holmes had taken up position by the fireplace, his gaze now fixed on the edge of the mantelpiece. A small smudge of soot had caught his eye, and with a flick of his handkerchief he wiped it away, revealing a shallow groove in the wood beneath. He said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked to the window. Drawing back the curtain slightly, he peered into the garden below, where a withered lawn stretched into the fog. Then, with the same measured calm, he returned to the centre of the room. "Lestrade," he said, "I will require the housekeeper, your most detailed diagram of this room, and the full personal histories of both Mr. Haythorne and Mr. Rowe. Additionally, I want to know who knew they had returned from Paris." Lestrade looked at him askance. "You think this was premeditated?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "I think that in any good illusion, the audience is asked to focus on what is loudest, but in this case it is not the gunshot that matters, it is the silence between them." He turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, we must speak with Mrs. Whitcomb." And with that he was out the door, moving not with haste but with purpose, a purpose sharpened by some glint of insight he had not yet shared. As I followed him down the corridor, I had the distinct impression that Holmes already sensed the shape of the truth, though its features remained cloaked in mist. Just like the morning outside. Chapter 3. The First Clues. A Scene of Deception. Mrs. Whitcomb was precisely the sort of housekeeper one expected to find in a respectable Mayfair residence. Elderly, straight-backed and stern of expression, with a starched collar and the air of a woman who knew the intimate habits of dust. She greeted Holmes with a stiffness that bordered on suspicion, though I sensed that her unease stemmed more from the situation than the man himself. "I've worked in this house for 16 years, she said, leading us to a modest sitting room on the ground floor, and never in all my days have I seen such wickedness beneath this roof." Holmes offered her a courteous nod. "We are not here to trouble you, Mrs. Whitcomb, only to clarify a few details." She sniffed, folded her hands. "You'll want to know about the shot, I expect, or rather the one I didn't hear." "Precisely," Holmes said. "You were asleep at the time?" "I was, sir, yes. It was some time after 2, I believe. I awoke suddenly. No reason for it that I can recall. Then I heard it, a sharp crack like a firework, but only once. I sat up and listened for a second. Nothing else followed. Then silence. No voices? No footsteps? None. Just the wind, and that distant sound the city always makes at night." "Do you often wake up easily?" "I do, sir. Light sleeper always have been, especially since Mr. Haythorn's return. He and Mr. Rowe came back from the continent only yesterday, and there's been tension in the house since they walked through the door." Holmes tilted his head. "Tension?" Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. "You understand, sir, I don't make it my business to pry, but I couldn't help but notice. Mr. Rowe seemed troubled. He hardly spoke to the maids, took his supper alone. Mr. Haythorn was different, cheerful, but too cheerful, forced, like he was trying to pretend something hadn't happened." Holmes tapped a finger to his lips. "Did you hear any argument between them?" "Not directly. Just raised voices yesterday afternoon, but not loud enough to make out words. Something private, I think." Holmes turned toward the door, then paused. "Was anyone else in the house yesterday evening?" "No, sir. Just me and the cook. They sent the footman home for the night. Said they needed privacy." Holmes's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. Thank you, Mrs. Whitcomb. You've been most helpful." He stood, and I followed him back into the corridor. He said nothing for several minutes as we ascended the stairs again, his pace deliberate, his mind clearly grinding through possibilities. He stopped halfway up and turned to me. "Watson," he said, "how do you suppose a man might fire a revolver twice and have only one shot be heard by someone directly above the room?" I frowned. "If one of the shots was somehow muffled? A pillow, perhaps?" "A common supposition, but recall, the housekeeper heard one shot, not none. Therefore the silenced shot, if there was one, would not explain the mystery unless we assume that the audible shot was not the fatal one." "You think the first shot missed?" Holmes only smiled. "Come." Back in the drawing room, Lestrade was poring over a crude diagram of the room prepared by one of his men. Holmes stepped past him without a word and resumed his slow circuit of the space, this time pausing at seemingly insignificant objects: a porcelain vase on a shelf, the edge of the carpet by the fireplace, a row of books behind the writing desk. He crouched suddenly, examining the leg of the desk. A tiny chip had flaked off the polished wood, and Holmes leaned in, brushing it lightly with a gloved finger. "Observe, Watson, a recent mark, but no corresponding bullet hole? Curious." He stood again and turned his attention to the curtains. He drew them aside, revealing a closed and latched window. Holmes examined the latch, then unfastened it, and slowly opened the pane. Outside, the garden was still swathed in mist, but even through the haze I saw something that gave me pause, a narrow patch of disturbed soil beneath the window, as though someone had recently stood there. Holmes saw it too. "Lestrade," he called over his shoulder, "was the back garden searched?" "Not thoroughly. No footprints. We assumed the shooter had to be inside." Holmes gave a quiet, almost imperceptible hum. "Another assumption that may prove hazardous." He closed the window again and returned to the fireplace, where he knelt and examined the grate. A small pile of ash remained, grey and powdery. He sifted through it with a brass poker until he withdrew a scrap of half-burned paper. The writing was gone, consumed by the flame, but something about its thickness and the faint glint of ink suggested a letterhead or official document. "Destroyed in haste," he murmured. "But why?" Lestrade, growing visibly impatient, crossed his arms. "We've got Rowe in the house with the weapon. No one else entered or left. What more is there to look for?" Holmes turned to him, his voice calm but cool. "Inspector, you have a man holding a revolver and another man shot through the heart. But you lack a motive, a second bullet, a timeline that fits the evidence, and any sign of a struggle or guilt. Does that sound like a closed case to you?" Lestrade bristled. "He had the weapon." which had no residue on his hands, and yet he was unconscious when found. I dare say a murderer would be more careful. He turned to me. Watson, do you recall the smudge above the mantelpiece? I nodded. Holmes gestured to it. Not accidental. That groove is where a decorative object was removed recently. I'd wager it was hollow, perhaps just large enough to conceal a revolver. But the revolver was in Rowe's hand. Exactly. Which means the killer placed it there after the fact. But then how did he leave? Holmes paced once more to the locked door, examined the latch again and stepped back. A mechanism, he said quietly. Or an accomplice, but not magic. He turned, coat flaring behind him, and looked directly at Lestrade. This is no ordinary case, Inspector. It was staged, not just to conceal a killer, but to send a message. He paused, then added in a softer tone, and I fear we are not the intended audience. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. By midday, the house at Hatherbridge Square had taken on the air of a stage before the curtains rise. Quiet, expectant, with a gathering cast of characters whose roles were not yet known. At Holmes's insistence, Lestrade had summoned anyone with a connection to the deceased or the events of the previous evening. One by one they began to arrive, stepping from the fog as if conjured by Holmes's will. The first to appear was Miss Adeline Vervand, Haythorne's secretary. A striking woman in her late 20s, she was composed to the point of discomfort. Her morning attire impeccable, her eyes dry, her voice steady, yet something in the tightness of her posture betrayed strain. I came as soon as I heard, she said, her hands clasped in front of her. Mr. Haythorne was a brilliant man. Difficult, yes, but generous to those he trusted. Had he been behaving oddly since his return from Paris? Holmes asked. Miss Vervain's brow twitched. He seemed preoccupied, nervous perhaps. He didn't say much, only that he had something important to finish before week's end. He asked me to remain on call, though he never sent word. Holmes studied her in silence for a beat. You were not present at the house last night? No, I was home, alone. A pause, then. Do you suspect Mr. Rowe? I suspect that nothing is as it seems, Holmes replied, mildly. Tell me, Miss Vervain, was Mr. Haythorne involved in any business dealings abroad that you were privy to? She hesitated. Only vaguely. He met with several financiers in Paris. There was mention of a contract, a very old one, he said, but he was unusually secretive. Holmes nodded. That will do for now. Please wait in the study. As she left, I turned to Holmes. You noted her hands? Indeed, he said softly. No ink stains. Odd, for a secretary. Next came Mr. Lucian Greaves, a solicitor in his early 50s, whose wire spectacles and precisely trimmed beard gave him the look of a man who had long since traded idealism for efficiency. He arrived with a briefcase and a furrowed brow. Tragic business, he said, shaking hands with Lestrade before acknowledging Holmes with a wary glance. I handled Mr. Haythorne's estate, among other matters. Among them, Holmes echoed. Greaves pursed his lips. He and Mr. Rowe were more than business partners. They were named in each other's wills, a curious arrangement but not illegal. What did the estate entail? Properties in London and Surrey, some holdings abroad, France and the Low Countries. Also, a locked safe deposit box at King's Trust Bank. Haythorne never disclosed its contents, not even to me. Curious, Holmes murmured, and his relationship with Rowe? Strained toward the end. Rowe accused him of fraud on more than one occasion, privately of course. There was a sense, I believe, that Haythorne had betrayed a mutual agreement. Do you know if either man had enemies? Greaves gave a dry chuckle. Everyone in business has enemies, Mr. Holmes, especially those who deal in secrets. Holmes motioned for Lestrade to escort Greaves to the study. When he was gone, Holmes turned to me. We are gathering shadows, Watson, but they have not yet taken shape. The next to arrive was Clara Wren, a housemaid formerly employed by the Haythorne household until 2 months prior. She had been dismissed under unclear circumstances, though Lestrade had located her quickly enough through local contacts. She entered the house nervously, twisting her hands in her shawl. I don't know what you expect me to say, she began, eyes darting to every corner. I haven't been in this house since August. You were dismissed by Mr. Haythorne? Holmes asked. No, by Mr. Rowe. He said I was careless with letters, but I never touched anything I wasn't supposed to. Letters? Holmes inquired, tone sharpening. Clara nodded. He was angry about a letter going missing. Said it was important. accused me of throwing it out or stealing it, but I hadn't. It wasn't even addressed to him. It was in French, I think. Did you read it? She shook her head vigorously. Never. I just remember. The paper, heavy, with a dark red seal. Holmes leaned back slightly. And after your dismissal, did Mr. Haythorne ever try to contact you? No, not once. Lestrade dismissed her with a note to remain nearby. As she left, Holmes turned to me. The letter, he said softly. Likely the same thing that was burned in the fireplace. Rowe may have destroyed it himself, or someone else feared its discovery. And the seal? I asked. He tapped his temple. We mustn't guess, but that detail will be critical. Mark my words. The final figure to arrive was Mr. Arlo Kemp, a quiet, sharp-featured man of indeterminate age who claimed to have worked with Haythorne on an archaeological project in Tunisia. He had been summoned by telegram, and though his connection seemed tenuous at best, Holmes insisted he be included. Mr. Haythorne owed me money, Kemp stated bluntly. We'd planned a second expedition last year, but he pulled out, without explanation, said it was too dangerous. Dangerous? Holmes repeated. He said we weren't alone, that something had followed us back. There was a silence in the room then, not from disbelief, but from the sudden chill of a statement that felt deeply out of place. Holmes said nothing, only studied Kemp's face with unsettling intensity. Lestrade frowned. Are you implying something supernatural? Kemp gave a half shrug. I'm implying Haythorne believed it. When Kemp too was escorted away, Holmes walked to the hearth, gazing into the cold grate. Secrets buried in the earth, he murmured. A letter sealed in red, a partnership unravelling, and the silence between two gunshots. He looked at me. We now have a cast, Watson. The stage is set. But what, I wonder, is the play? Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring. The initial tide of suspicion surged quickly and predictably, straight toward Elias Rowe. Lestrade had wasted no time, and by that afternoon, Rowe was well enough to sit up in bed, though still pale and dazed. I examined him again personally and could find no physical ailment beyond residual weakness. Whatever had felled him the night before was not of the body, but of the mind. Holmes waited until I had given my assurances before stepping into the room. Rowe looked up, his expression flickering between confusion and fear. Am I under arrest? That depends, Holmes replied coolly, on what you choose to say next. Lestrade stood in the corner, arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He believed he had his man. A revolver found in hand, a locked room, no other entrance, and a motive, however vague, in the form of a soured partnership. Rowe blinked at Holmes. I don't know what happened, he said. Truly. One moment I was sitting with Percival. We were speaking, drinking. The next, I felt dizzy, then darkness. You recall no gunshots? None? Do you often faint? Never. Holmes stepped closer, studying Rowe's face. Do you recall what you were discussing? Rowe hesitated. We'd argued earlier, about a document, something he found in Paris. I wanted him to destroy it. He refused. What sort of document? Rowe looked down. It's difficult to explain. It wasn't just about business. It was older, deeper, something to do with a society he'd been in contact with. Holmes's eyes flickered. A society? He wouldn't name it, only said they watch more than they act, said we'd stumbled on something not meant to be found. Lestrade scoffed audibly, but Holmes remained perfectly still. Did you see the document yourself? Holmes asked. No, he only described it, said it referenced an oath and something binding. He said it was connected to Tunisia, to our work there. Holmes gave a slow nod. And you feared what exactly? That this society would come after you? Rowe looked genuinely pained. No, I feared what Percival might do with the knowledge. He had a tendency to use what he shouldn't. He never believed consequences applied to him. Lestrade stepped forward. And so you shot him? Rowe's face contorted with shock. No! I would never. Percival was my friend. We argued, yes, but I didn't kill him. You were found with the weapon in your hand, Lestrade said flatly. I didn't even own a revolver. And yet, it was in your grip when we entered the room. Holmes raised a hand, silencing the exchange. Tell me, Mr. Rowe, do you recall the placement of the glasses? On the table? Yes. One was near him, the other near me. Holmes turned to me. Watson, we shall need those glasses examined for traces. sedatives in particular. Rose's head jerked up. You think I was drugged? I think someone intended for you to sleep through a murder, Holmes said calmly, or to awaken holding a revolver, confused, surrounded by circumstances built to condemn you. Rowe looked at him with disbelief, then slowly sank back into his pillows. After the interview, Lestrade cornered Holmes at the stairwell. You're giving him too much credit, Holmes. The man's guilty, and you're letting his theatrics distract you. Holmes regarded him coolly. On the contrary, Inspector, I'm watching a man who knows he's trapped and cannot fathom how the trap was laid. His confusion is too complete to be false. That does not exonerate him, but it tells us something vital. The true killer counted on Rowe's innocence to make their plan plausible. Lestrade shook his head. Then who do you propose? That secretary of his, the solicitor, that explorer fellow? Holmes smiled faintly. Patience, Lestrade. The truth is a fabric, not a flash. Still, even I had to admit, Rowe made for an ideal suspect. Motive, opportunity, weapon in hand. The public, no doubt, would need little persuasion. It was the classic portrait of a jealous partner driven to violence. And then came the complication. That evening, while Holmes and I were reviewing transcripts of Miss Vervain's last correspondence with Haythorne, a uniformed constable knocked briskly at the door. Inspector Lestrade requests your immediate presence, he said breathlessly. There's been a break-in. Holmes rose without a word, his coat already in hand. The break-in had occurred at Mr. Lucian Greaves's offices, a modest suite near Chancery Lane. The front door had been forced, the interior drawers ransacked, but most notable was what hadn't been taken. Nothing stolen, Greaves fumed as we arrived. Not a damn thing, just papers thrown about, contracts, ledgers, client records, all scattered, but untouched. Holmes examined the lock. Crude work, opportunistic or meant to appear so. Anything missing at all? Greaves hesitated. Yes. There was a folder, a thin one. Personal notes on Haythorne and Rowe's French holdings. Mostly correspondence and tax filings. It wasn't valuable, but now it's gone. Were those papers related to the safe deposit box? Only indirectly. Holmes turned slowly. I believe we have just witnessed the first sign of panic from someone who believed the crime had gone unnoticed. And you still think it wasn't Rowe? Lestrade asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The man in bed upstairs did not break into this office tonight, Inspector. Greaves adjusted his spectacles. So you believe someone is cleaning up loose ends? Precisely. But what they fail to consider, Holmes said with quiet satisfaction, is that disruption leaves fingerprints. Metaphorical, if not literal. Back at Baker Street, as we settled in for the night, Holmes stood by the fireplace, pipe in hand, his brow furrowed. The evidence against Rowe is convincing, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. Far too convincing. He turned to the window, staring out into the fog. This is no act of passion, Watson. It is a performance, and we are not the audience. It is the killer who waits for applause. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. The next morning found Holmes uncharacteristically still. He sat at our breakfast table with untouched toast before him, his gaze fixed on a single sheet of paper. The inventory list Lestrade had compiled from the crime scene. He had read it 3 times already, lips moving slightly with each pass. I knew that it looked well. It meant something didn't fit. And when something didn't fit in Holmes's world, it was only a matter of time before everything unravelled. He looked up suddenly. Watson, when we examined the drawing room, what was on the mantelpiece? I set down my cup. 2 candlesticks, the clock, and a porcelain figurine. Precisely, Holmes said. And yet Mrs. Whitcomb said there used to be a mirror hanging above the hearth. I blinked. Yes, she did mention that, but it wasn't there. Nor was it mentioned in the constable's itemised inventory. Curious, don't you think? A heavy wall-mounted mirror gone. No one seems to have noticed. You think it was removed recently? Holmes stood. I think it was removed during the crime. This idea, like many of Holmes's initial theories, seemed absurd on its face. But he was already moving, hat in hand, eyes sharp with fresh purpose. Within the hour we were back at Hatherbridge Square, joined by Lestrade, who was already combing through witness statements with growing irritation. A mirror, he said sceptically as Holmes explained. That's what you've brought me back for? Holmes said nothing. Instead, he walked into the drawing room, gestured for silence, and began examining the wall above the fireplace. There, behind a painting that had clearly been hastily rehung, were 2 empty brass hooks. He stepped back. Mrs. Whitcomb. The housekeeper appeared moments later, wiping her hands on her apron. Yes, Mr. Holmes? The mirror that hung here, where is it? She blinked. It was removed, sir, yesterday morning. Mr. Haythorne had the footman take it down, said he was having it repaired. Holmes turned slowly to Lestrade. And yet the footman was dismissed for the evening. There is no repair order, and no one has seen the mirror since. Lestrade frowned. You think it was used in the murder? Holmes ignored the question. Mrs. Whitcomb, can you describe the mirror? It was oval, heavy, gilt frame, about 3 feet tall. Been here since before I started. Thank you. She left, and Holmes turned back to us. That mirror was removed with purpose. Not before the crime, but for the crime. And its absence is our inconsistency, Lestrade sighed. You'll have to explain. Holmes walked to the centre of the room, tapping his cane against the floorboards. We know 2 shots were fired. Only one was heard. We know the door was locked from the inside. And we know Rowe held the revolver. But what we don't know is where the second bullet went. He gestured toward the fireplace. What if it didn't go anywhere? I frowned. You think it struck the mirror? Precisely. Mirrors have a curious property, Watson. They reflect more than images. They redirect momentum. A bullet striking a mirror at an angle could ricochet. A skilled shooter could use it to alter the trajectory. Lestrade blinked. You're saying the victim was not shot directly. I am saying, Holmes replied, that the shot was fired from an indirect position, perhaps even from the garden window, striking the mirror and then the victim. Thus, the noise would be distorted, the angle misleading, the illusion complete. And the mirror was removed afterward to hide the evidence. Correct. A missing shard would reveal the point of impact, but there's more. Holmes moved swiftly to the window and opened it. Watson, you noted the disturbed soil beneath the sill? Yes. Holmes pointed to the sill itself. Notice anything? I looked closer. A faint smudge, a nick in the wood, but more telling, scraped paint, as though something metallic had rested there. Someone fired from here, I said quietly. Someone very clever, Holmes said, and someone who counted on Lestrade's instinct to focus on the body, not the room. Lestrade, to his credit, said nothing. Holmes straightened. Now, let us revisit the suspects. Who among them had access to the house yesterday morning, knew the layout intimately, and might have had reason to stage a murder with such theatrical precision? We both answered at once. Adeline Vervin, Holmes nodded. She claimed to be home, but no one can verify that, and her hands, free of ink, unusual for a secretary. Lestrade muttered. Still circumstantial? Then let us gather more. Later that afternoon, Holmes paid an unannounced visit to Miss Vervain's lodgings. I accompanied him, and to her credit she welcomed us without visible unease. Have you learned more? She asked, voice even. Holmes smiled. Enough to know that the mirror in the drawing-room was removed after Haythorne's return from Paris. A curious decision, no? She hesitated. He didn't tell me why. Perhaps he intended to redecorate. Odd timing for redecoration, particularly when one is expecting a confrontation with an old partner. She said nothing. Her fingers tapped lightly against the side of her chair. Miss Vervain, Holmes said gently, did Mr. Haythorne confide in you about a certain document, a sealed letter from Paris? Now her face changed. Subtly, but unmistakably. A flicker of recognition. Then carefully. I may have seen something of the kind. May have? I transcribed portions of a letter in French. I was told to destroy the draft afterward. Did you? No, she admitted. I kept it. It frightened me. Holmes leaned forward. May I see it? Reluctantly she rose and crossed to her desk. From a hidden compartment beneath the blotter, she withdrew a folded sheet and handed it over. Holmes opened it, scanned it quickly, and his eyes sharpened. Watson, he said softly, we've just found our inconsistency, and the shadow it casts is very long. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. Holmes did not speak for the entirety of our journey back to Baker Street. The letter, what remained of it, was folded crisply in his pocket, and his eyes, half-lidded behind the rising curls of his pipe smoke, betrayed a mind spinning deeper into abstraction. I'd seen this look before, often in the quiet hours before a revelation. When we arrived, he spread the letter on the table beneath the lamplight, smoothing the creases carefully with his fingertips. I moved to his side, peering down at the neat but faded script. It was written in French, in a hand that suggested haste and urgency, though Holmes translated aloud with calm precision. The debt is not forgotten. The name was spoken beneath vaulted stone, and the seal broken by foreign hands. The price remains. They will not write. They will come. I felt the chill of it settle on my shoulders. What does it mean? Holmes tapped the edge of the paper. It is a warning, Watson. A threat delivered in silence. The vaulted stone, likely Tunisia. The seal, the red wax Clara Wren mentioned. Someone, or something, was disturbed on that expedition. I leaned back. And yet this letter was never officially recorded, never delivered through proper channels. Haythorne hid it. Miss Vervain transcribed it under false pretences, which tells us he feared scrutiny. He was being watched. Holmes rose abruptly and paced to the window, gazing out at the shifting fog. And now the mirror is gone. A bullet ricochets from glass, a staged suicide, a letter half burned, and a woman who claims to keep secrets while hiding her ink-stained hands. I frowned. But you said her hands were clean. Precisely, Holmes said, turning. Too clean. No secretary with daily correspondence maintained spotless fingers, unless, of course, she was not a secretary at all. At that moment, a knock came at the door, sharp, rapid, urgent. I opened it to find a breathless constable standing in the hallway, his cheeks red from the cold. Inspector Lestrade says to come at once, he said. There's been another incident. We followed without question. The cab took us not to Hatherbridge Square, but to a quiet inn near the Thames. There, in a rented room on the second floor, we found Clara Wren, the dismissed maid, seated against the wall, alive, but pale as death. Her hands trembled as she clutched a cup of tea. Lestrade stood beside her, a deep crease in his brow. On the floor near the window lay a broken flower pot and scattered glass. A single bullet hole marked the plaster beside her head. She was shot through the window, Lestrade said grimly. Barely missed her. I knelt beside her. Miss Wren, are you hurt? She shook her head. I was writing. I heard the pane crack, and then I saw the hole. Holmes examined the shattered glass, then the hole in the wall. He stepped to the window, peering out into the night. The shot came from the alley, long-range suppressed. Lestrade crossed his arms. She's lucky to be alive. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned, kneeling before Clara Wren. Why did you tell us about the red-sealed letter? I thought it mattered. It did, and someone else thought so too. Enough to try and silence. You. That confirms what I feared. The first murder was only the opening act. He stood again. This was no warning shot, Inspector. It was a rehearsal. The killer failed once. They will not fail again. Lestrade stiffened. You think they're still in London? I think, Holmes said, they've never left. We returned to Baker Street in grim silence. Holmes vanished into his laboratory while I sat in the study, digesting the events of the evening. When he re-emerged, he held a matchbox-sized device in his hand, a chemical test strip faintly discoloured. Traces of oil and charcoal residue on the interior of the broken flower pot, he announced. Not from soil, from a suppressed firearm. The shooter fired from concealment, likely using a silencer crafted with materials local to the continent. A professional, I said. Indeed, and one with a very specific purpose. He dropped into his armchair and steepled his fingers. Let us return, Watson, to motive, the key to every mystery. We have assumed Haythorne was the intended target because he died. But what if that's the misdirection? What if the true target was Rowe all along? But Rowe is alive. Precisely, because someone failed to finish the job. Haythorne's death was staged to implicate Rowe, but not to kill him. Rowe was meant to perish quietly, confused, condemned. That is why he was drugged. That is why the revolver was placed in his hand. I felt the realization dawning slowly. And Clara Wren? She was a loose end. She knew about the letter. Which means our killer is not just cleaning up a murder, Watson. They are correcting an error. The implications settled between us like dust. Holmes stood once more, his energy rising again. There is someone among our suspects, someone still within the circle, who fears exposure, someone who knew Haythorne and Rowe's business, who understood the letter's danger, and who had both the skill and audacity to manipulate the scene. I looked at him. Miss Vervain? Perhaps, or someone cleverer still. But we must tread carefully. The next move won't be subtle. He turned to the door. Come, Watson. We shall revisit Greaves. He has not told us everything, and I suspect his briefcase contains more than legal contracts. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Greaves received us in his quarters at the Hotel Montpellier, a respectable establishment near Paddington, one that seemed too modest for a man of his supposed stature. He was dressed immaculately once more, black cravat, silver tie-pin, and that same air of cultivated fatigue that never quite left his voice. Holmes sat first, uninvited, and motioned for me to close the door behind us. Greaves, not yet seated, blinked. "Is this official?" he asked, feigning levity. "Or do I require a solicitor present?" "You are a solicitor, Mr. Greaves," Holmes said coolly, "one recently involved in the affairs of a man found dead in his own study with a bullet wound to the temple." Greaves sighed, seating himself. "We've already covered this ground, Mr. Holmes. I had no hand in Haythorn's death." "Indeed. But I suspect you've had your hand in far more things than you've declared." I glanced at Holmes, sensing his shift. He was testing something, pressing not for information, but for the shape of Greaves' resistance. "You mentioned earlier," Holmes continued, "that your relationship with Mr. Haythorn was professional, that you advised him on legal matters tied to his shipping contracts." "Yes. And yet you failed to mention Tunisia, or the archaeological transport papers signed in Marseille." Greaves stiffened. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker in the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, but to Holmes it might as well have been a confession. "Those weren't of consequence," Greaves muttered. "They were not of consequence," Holmes echoed. "How curious, when the entirety of this affair seems to revolve around what was brought back from that expedition, including the letter Haythorn kept hidden, and which Miss Wren unwittingly exposed." Greaves's voice turned cold. "What are you implying?" Holmes ignored the question. Instead, he rose and walked slowly around the room, observing. He paused at the writing desk where a stack of documents lay neatly ordered. Contracts, it seemed, arranged by date. "Is this your hand?" Holmes asked suddenly, pointing to a line of script on the topmost letter. Greaves peered over. "Yes." "And this?" Holmes produced from his coat pocket the torn letter, the one transcribed by Miss Vervain. He placed it beside the contract. Greaves hesitated. "That's not mine." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Holmes smiled thinly and returned the paper to his pocket. "Good. That confirms what I suspected." Before Greaves could object, Holmes was already at the door. "Thank you, Mr. Greaves. I do hope your memory continues to improve." Outside, I fell into step beside him. "What did you learn?" I asked. "Nothing conclusive," Holmes said, "but I needed to know whether he would lie about the handwriting, and he did." "You think he wrote the transcribed letter?" "No, but I think he knew who did, and in denying it too quickly he betrayed fear, not of being caught in falsehood, but of being connected to the contents." We walked for some minutes before Holmes changed direction abruptly. "Where are we going now?" I asked. "Back to Rose's cell. There is something he said during our last visit, a phrase that I let pass without question. I believe it now to be key. Scotland Yard received us with tired reluctance. The constables had grown used to our presence, and the jailers waved us through with no more than a grumble. Roe was seated on his cot, his eyes clearer than before, though. His expression remained distant. "Back again?" he said, without surprise. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Roe, during our last conversation you mentioned a phrase. He thought I couldn't see it. What were you referring to?" Roe blinked. "The mirror." Holmes nodded. "Go on." "It wasn't just about seeing. It was about knowing. He thought I wouldn't realize what he'd taken, but I knew the moment I saw him staring into it. He was looking for something, some answer. He treated it like it held a voice." Holmes remained utterly still. "Who are you speaking of?" Roe hesitated. "Haythorn." Holmes tilted his head. "But you claimed no memory of the events the night he died." "I don't. But I remember before the mirror broke, there were things he wouldn't let me near. He had begun locking drawers. He treated the mirror like it had changed somehow. He said it was listening." I felt the hair on my neck rise. "Did he say why?" Holmes pressed. "No, only that it had been awakened, that he'd made a mistake bringing it back." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you bring it back?" Roe shook his head. "It arrived by courier, weeks after we returned from Tunisia. He didn't open it for days, then one night he did, and after that, everything changed." We left the prison in silence, the cold air biting into our coats. "He's telling the truth," Holmes said finally. "Or at the very least what he believes is the truth. The mirror was not merely a curiosity, it was an object of significance, perhaps even of obsession." "You believe it holds some value?" no doubt, but I also believe it was a means. The killer used it to trigger something. Paranoia, fear, confusion. It was part of the staging, not just a prop. Which brings us back to the question, I said. Who had the motive, the skill, and the proximity? Holmes gave a thin smile. That is the question I intend to answer. But to do so, we must provoke a reaction. How? By making our would-be killer believe they have succeeded, and that we are no longer watching. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. It was not even 48 hours after our return from Rowe's prison cell when the second event occurred. This time, in the dead of night, and without a single shot fired. At precisely 2 minutes past 3 in the morning, Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street looking like a man freshly buried and exhumed in the same breath. His collar was twisted, his coat half-buttoned, and his boots left dark trails on the carpet as Mrs. Hudson, stifling her horror, let him inside. Holmes was already dressed. He had not gone to bed. He rarely did during such cases. Instead, he had been seated cross-legged in his armchair, pipe cold, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared at the darkened fireplace with unblinking focus. When Lestrade entered, Holmes rose as though he had been expecting him precisely at that moment. "What has happened?" he asked without preamble. "Attempted murder, and it bears the same stink as Haythorne's death," Lestrade said, voice low. "Victim?" "Miss Ela Vervain." That name alone sent a cold jolt through me. "She's alive?" I asked. "Barely. Someone tried to smother her in her sleep. Lodgings on Glenmore Street, East End. The landlady heard a struggle and called for the constables. They didn't catch the bastard, but they say there was blood on the pillow and scratch marks on the windowsill where someone climbed out." Holmes was already moving, coat on, scarf knotted, boots following sharply behind. "Come, Watson, there is no time." Miss Vervain's room was modest, made warm by a dying coal stove and cluttered with scattered manuscripts, maps, and 2 chipped teacups left beside a journal. She sat on a small settee, pale as the paper she clutched, her left cheek bearing a livid red mark that stretched from the temple to the jaw. Her voice was faint when she spoke. I didn't hear him come in. I only woke when something pressed over my face. I couldn't breathe. My arms, he had them pinned. I tried to scream." Holmes knelt beside her, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Did you see anything? A face, perhaps? A smell? A sound?" She trembled, her fingers tightening around the paper. There was something sharp, not a knife, something metallic pressed against my throat. But he didn't speak, and when I managed to grab the edge of the blanket and pulled it, he fled. Holmes turned his gaze to the window. The pane was half open, frost clinging to the frame. He moved with swift precision, examining the sill. Then he reached outside and brought his fingers back dusted with faint red clay. He stood abruptly. "Inspector," he said, "have someone cordon off the alley. There's a narrow ledge here, and if the man fled over the rooftops, we may yet find a trail." Lestrade motioned to the constables, but Holmes was already at the door. "I'll not rely on others to find it," he murmured. "Do you have a suspect?" I asked as we followed him into the night air. "I have more than that," Holmes said. "I have a prediction, and so far it is playing out precisely as I hoped." He darted down the alley behind the boarding house, his lantern sweeping wide arcs over brick and soot. I followed with effort, boots slipping on the frost-slick stones. Then Holmes paused. There. Beneath a stack of crates he revealed a scrap of black cloth, snagged and torn at the edge. He held it to the lantern. Wool. Fine. Foreign weave. Not the sort worn by dockside workers or street thieves. He moved quickly, now confident of the route. We passed 3 rooftops and climbed 1 trellis before coming upon a sloped roof dusted with frost, where fresh boot marks arched, toward a broken gutter. Holmes peered down. "No blood," he muttered, "but a second descent here, judging by the disturbed tiles. Whoever our intruder was, he's practiced." "Do you believe Miss Vervain was the target?" I asked. "I believe she was the message." He turned, a lantern catching a gleam of glass in the shadows, a small glint reflecting just beside the 3rd chimney. Holmes retrieved it. A tiny silver disc, no larger than a button, engraved with the letters L.H. "Greaves," I whispered. Holmes nodded. Or someone who wanted us to think it was Greaves. When we returned to the boarding house, Miss Vervain had composed herself. She was sitting straighter now, sipping tea brought by her landlady. Holmes knelt again and spoke gently. "Miss Vervain, I need to ask something rather difficult of you." She met his gaze with surprising steadiness. "Go on. The letter you copied, did you keep the original, or any part of it?" She hesitated. "I gave it to Haythorne, but I made a second copy. I wasn't sure if I'd be paid, and it seemed wise to have proof of my work. Do you still have it?" She nodded. "Locked in the drawer beneath my bed." Holmes fetched it himself. The paper was folded crisply, preserved in a wax paper sleeve. He read it silently, eyes narrowing at certain turns of phrase. At last, he handed it to me. It was a curious document, half letter, half riddle. It spoke of returning the mirror before the voices grew louder, of a pact broken, of a second guardian who knew but did not act. I looked at Holmes. "Does this change the game?" "No," he said, eyes sharp. "It confirms it. The second guardian, the one who knew, that's our next visit." "To whom?" "To someone who has kept themselves conspicuously neutral," Holmes replied. "Someone who has said little, claimed less, and watched everything." He pocketed the letter and turned toward the door. "The game is accelerating, Watson, and the pieces are moving into place." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. We departed Miss Vervain's lodging just as dawn began to bleed over the East End rooftops. Holmes, coat flaring and face unreadable, moved at a pace that forced me into a half-trot to keep up. His eyes were focused forward, but I could sense his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions at once. "Holmes," I said as we reached the main road, "you spoke of a second guardian. Who is it?" He answered without turning. "Latham Crowthorne." Crowthorne, the solicitor, the very one who drafted Haythorne's will, managed the estate after the explosion in Crimea Lane, and acted, quietly, as executor of Greaves' final business contracts. He is the invisible string that tethers the dead to the living in this affair. "But he said nothing of significance," I replied. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, and silence. "Watson is often the loudest confession." We arrived at Crowthorne and Delancey's office on Montwick Street just after 8, and to our surprise found the gas lamps already lit and the front door unlocked. A clerk greeted us, nervously I thought, and led us to a study lined with shelves of thick tomes and bound ledgers. Latham Crowthorne was a man in his early 60s, lean and immaculately groomed. His silver hair lay flat as steel wire, and his expression was that of a man perpetually caught between courtesy and calculation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, rising. "I had half expected you sooner." Holmes took a seat without invitation. "Then I trust you know why we're here." "I do not," Crowthorne replied, settling behind his desk. "Though I imagine it relates to the unfortunate death of Mr. Haythorne and the subsequent attempt on Miss Vervain." Holmes studied him in silence. Crowthorne continued. "The newspapers suggest some connection to the Greaves estate, but as I have already informed the Yard, I had no knowledge of any such letter or recording." "And yet you were one of the last individuals to speak with Mr. Haythorne, were you not?" Holmes asked. "I was. A mere routine discussion regarding trust disbursements. He gave no indication of fear or urgency." "Did he mention the letter Miss Vervain transcribed?" "He did not." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Then allow me to ask plainly. Are you aware of what that letter contains?" Crowthorne hesitated, then folded his hands atop the desk. "I suspected," he said quietly, "though I never saw it in full. I knew Mr. Greaves had written certain confessions. I advised him against it. Why? Because some truths serve only to unsettle the dead, and the dead, Mr. Holmes, have a way of pulling down the living with them." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Who else knew about the letter?" "I cannot say for certain." "You can guess," Holmes replied sharply. Crowthorne's eyes flickered. "There was a woman, Margot Temple. She was close to Greaves once, a companion in his more experimental years. She vanished after Crimea Lane. Some said she died in the fire, others believed she fled." Holmes stood abruptly. "Then we must find her." "You won't," Crowthorne said, "because if she is alive, she's in hiding for a reason, and if she's dead, well, then the ghost is writing letters." We left shortly after, and Holmes was unusually silent as we returned to Baker Street. Once inside, he sat at his desk and unfolded a map, marking points with quick, precise jabs of the pencil. Haythorne's home, Miss Vervain's flat, Crimea Lane, and now Crowthorne's office. "They form a pattern," he murmured. I looked over his shoulder. "A pattern?" "Not of geography, Watson. of pressure points. Whoever is behind these events is attempting to erase something. Haythorne was a voice, Vervain a witness, Crowthorne a gatekeeper. The attacks aren't random, they are surgical. You believe Margot Temple is the next target? Or the origin? He leaned back. She was there when Greaves lost control of the Crimea Lane project. She was the one person with knowledge of what happened in the sealed vault beneath that building. The explosion was not the result of a gas leak, Watson. It was intentional. A purge. I felt the blood drain from my face. Good Lord, Holmes. You believe this was a cover-up? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that Greaves was involved in something far more volatile than simple corruption. And now someone is removing the remnants, one by one. Just then a sharp knock rattled the front door. Mrs. Hudson opened it and stumbled a boy, no more than 10, his clothes soaked with rain and his breath puffing in panicked clouds. "You Mr. Holmes?" "I am." The boy held out a slip of paper, hand trembling. "Man told me to give you this. Said it was urgent." Holmes took the note and unfolded it. I leaned in as he read aloud. "You're not the only one who sees in silence. There is still one shot left. You will hear it before you understand it." There was no signature. Holmes folded the note neatly and slipped it into his jacket. "The culprit is shifting their strategy," he said. "They are no longer hiding. They are playing." "Playing?" he nodded. "A game of deduction. A game they think they can win." Chapter 11. The Bate Holmes Grand Strategy. That same evening, I returned from the apothecary to find our sitting room transformed. Holmes had cleared the table of its usual clutter and replaced it with a large topographical map of London, peppered with pins and neatly labelled strings crisscrossing between them, like the web of an obsessive cartographer. The fireplace roared in defiance of the July humidity, and Holmes, shirt sleeves rolled, pipe cold on the mantel, stood motionless, studying the tableau with the intensity of a predator. He did not turn when I entered. "It's a message," he said, not quite to me, or rather a challenge. "We have been formally invited into the next act." "You mean the note from the boy?" Holmes nodded. Its phrasing was calculated. Whoever sent it knows how I think, or thinks they do. He pointed to 3 locations marked in red: Greaves's townhouse, Haythorne's lodgings, and the ruins of Crimea Lane, all tied to the original scandal, all visited or targeted within the past fortnight. And now this message: "One shot left." That is no mere poetic flourish. It is literal. A third murder? Possibly, Holmes replied, but not necessarily by firearm. The shots may refer to events. Haythorne was silenced. Miss Vervain was nearly destroyed. There is one more domino left before the real curtain rises. I moved closer to the map, squinting at the lines. "What's this here? South Bank?" "A bait," Holmes said, "or it will be." He turned abruptly and began sorting through a stack of papers he had received earlier from a constable at Scotland Yard. "Margot Temple," he said, "vanished after the Crimea incident. Presumed dead. But I believe she survived, hidden beneath a new name." He produced a theatre poster. "Observe, Madame Rosetta, a spiritualist medium performing in Lambeth every 3rd Thursday. Description matches Margot precisely, down to the streak of white in her otherwise black hair." "A spiritualist?" I said, incredulous. Holmes gave a tight smile. "Where better for a ghost to hide than behind a veil of illusion." Within the hour, we were aboard a cab heading to Lambeth. The street was lined with crumbling brick buildings, and the hall where Madame Rosetta was due to perform sat hunched between a butcher's shop and an undertaker. Holmes made no move to enter. "We wait," he said, "for the show." For the shadow behind the curtain. The street darkened, the lamps flared. From inside came muffled applause as the séance began. Holmes observed the windows above. "Someone is watching her," he said. "How do you know?" "Because the curtains of the 2nd floor moved when her name was called." I squinted. But couldn't that be a servant? Servants do not draw revolvers when disturbed. I gasped. Holmes produced a small mirror and used it to reflect the lamplight upward in the rapid flashes, 3 short, 2 long, then 3 short again. "Morse code," I murmured. "Correct. And if the observer responds, we'll know they've military training. Not many of Margot's companions did, except one." "Colonel Radcliffe," I said slowly. "Precisely." We waited. A light flickered in answer. Identical code. Holmes grinned, teeth bared like a wolf. "We have him." "But why is he here?" "Because Radcliffe never believed the Crimea incident was over. He suspects the same truth I do. that Margot's silence is more dangerous than her voice. Suddenly a gunshot cracked through the air. The audience inside screamed. The doors flew open. Holmes was already moving, bolting inside. I followed in panic. The stage was chaos. People trampled chairs and overturned tables in their rush to flee. At the centre, Madame Rosetta, Margot, stood frozen, her eyes wide in recognition as Holmes approached. "You're too late," she whispered. "He's already here." Another shot rang out, this one closer. Holmes shoved her down behind the curtain and motioned for me to take cover. A shadow moved on the balcony above. "Radcliffe!" Holmes shouted. The figure did not answer, but the glint of a pistol betrayed him. Holmes darted behind a column as a third shot shattered a gas lamp above the stage. Glass rained down in a dazzling spray of sparks. I crawled to Margot and shielded her. "Stay down," I hissed. Holmes, moving with impossible swiftness, scaled the narrow side staircase leading to the balcony. I saw only flashes, his silhouette against the flame of the broken lamp, the blur of motion as he wrestled with the figure. Then silence. Moments later, Holmes emerged from the stairwell, brushing soot from his sleeves. Radcliffe slumped behind him, unconscious, but alive. "He's no killer," Holmes said, but he would have been if not stopped. He believed Margot would reveal what happened beneath Crimea Lane, and feared his complicity would be exposed. I helped Margot to her feet. "I wasn't going to," she murmured, "but now I might have to." Holmes regarded her with a strange solemnity. "The truth cannot remain buried forever, Miss Temple. The earth resents too many corpses in one place." Back at Baker Street later that night, Holmes poured himself a brandy and stood at the window. "We've sprung the trap," he said, "but not for the true hunter. Radcliffe was just another piece, disposable. Then who is left?" Holmes swirled the glass, watching the liquid catch the light. "Whoever sent that note knew we'd come for Margot. They wanted us to. And now that she's emerged, they will come for her. Not with bullets this time, but with silence." He turned to me, eyes gleaming with fierce certainty. "The final shot, Watson, has not yet been fired, but I know exactly where the gun is aimed." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The following morning, Holmes was already awake and seated by the hearth when I emerged, bleary-eyed, from my room. A faint line of ash curved along the floor beneath his chair, as though he had paced through the night and paused only to let thought overtake motion. The fire crackled low. Outside, London yawned into a fog-soaked dawn. He did not greet me, but held out a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Spiritualist survives assassination attempt. Military colonel arrested." A grainy sketch of Colonel Radcliffe stared back at me, moustache rigid even in ink. "They've made it public then?" I asked. Holmes nodded absently. As expected, Scotland Yard always chooses spectacle over subtlety. And Miss Temple? She remains under guard in Kensington. But the real danger has never been Radcliffe. He tapped the newspaper. He was merely a hound following scent, too obedient to know what he hunted. Holmes stood and walked to the window, his eyes tracing the waking city. I waited, knowing better than to interrupt whatever silent calculus consumed him. After some time, he spoke. "Watson, consider the curious detail we've ignored thus far." I blinked. "Which one?" "The telegram," he said. "The anonymous note left for Lestrade the night of Greaves's murder, the one with the cryptic message, 'Only silence separates the shots.'" I nodded slowly. "Yes. You suspected it referenced an order of events." "Not only that," Holmes said, turning to me now, his face alive with sharp purpose. "It reveals the tempo of the crime, the interval between each act. There is a timing to these events." He gestured for his violin and began to pluck a slow, deliberate rhythm on the strings. 2 short notes, then silence, then 1 long note. It's a musical structure, a triplet broken by a rest. I was confused. "You're suggesting the killer is composing something?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, I'm suggesting they are mirroring something. The original crime beneath Crimea Lane. There were 3 involved, Greaves, Haythorne and Temple. The first 2 are now dead. The third has surfaced, and within that silence, between the gunshots, our culprit lies." I rose slowly, understanding that I was beginning to stir. "You believe someone else was present that night?" Holmes nodded. "Not as a victim, as an observer. Someone who has waited patiently for years. Someone close to the victims, yet invisible in the background. He crossed to the desk and laid out 3 photographs. Greaves with his wife, Haythorne with a student cohort, and Margot Temple seated beside a young woman, sharp-eyed, modestly dressed, nearly forgettable. She was at both funerals, Holmes murmured. She visited the Temple's theatre under a false name, and more telling still, she once worked as Greaves's personal secretary. I leaned closer. Who is she? Miss Eliza Brent, he said. A quiet woman, no known affiliations, but she was the common link. Holmes then reached for a slim journal he had retrieved from Greaves's townhouse. I overlooked this at first, he admitted, thumbing through the pages. But last night something struck me. In Greaves's personal log, beneath ciphered notes on financial matters, he made reference to an Ibia multiple times, not as an employee, but as an accomplice. My eyes widened. Accomplice to what? Holmes held up a hand. Greaves, Haythorne and Radcliffe conspired in something that destroyed Margot's life and career. But Brent was the one who recorded it. She held the blackmail letters. She transcribed the threats. And when the men moved on, she remained. Forgotten. Perhaps betrayed. And now she's exacting revenge? Not merely revenge, Holmes said, voice dropping to a hush. She's reconstructing the night, repeating the pattern. But in doing so, she has left a trail of symmetry too neat, too theatrical. That is always the failing of those who see justice as a performance. He turned suddenly to me. She'll go for Temple next. I stiffened. But you said she's under guard. Holmes smiled grimly, and I said Brent is quiet, not incapable. He moved swiftly, gathering a coat, cane and revolver. We go to Kensington, he said. Now. When we arrived at the safe house, all seemed in order. A constable stood on the step and a nurse was visible through the upstairs window. But Holmes barely glanced at them. Instead, he approached the milkman across the street. You delivered to this address today? The man nodded. Every morning, sir, just 1 bottle. Holmes lifted it from the doorstep. The cap had a faint fingerprint smudge. Not fresh, he muttered. She's already inside. With a speed I'd come to recognise, he flung open the door, shouting for the guards. The constable spun, startled, then fell forward, unconscious. The second lay prone by the kitchen. Holmes dashed up the stairs. In the upstairs room, Margot Temple sat in a chair, eyes half-lidded, a shallow cut across her brow. Standing over her, calm, composed, was Eliza Brent. She held a small vial of powder in one hand and a folded letter in the other. I expected you sooner, she said. Holmes stepped inside. You gave yourself away, Miss Brent, not by ambition but by precision. Your obsession with rhythm led me straight to you. She smiled. I only wanted them to remember what they did to her, to me, to all of us. You remembered too much, Holmes said quietly, and now it's over. For a moment she seemed almost relieved. Then she gently set the vial on the table and raised her hands. Let the silence speak, she whispered. Holmes stepped forward and caught her as she swayed, suddenly pale. She poisoned herself? I asked. No, Holmes said. She drugged Margot. Brent wanted her to sleep through the final act, to forget, while the world remembered. He looked down at Brent, unconscious in his arms. A playwright's ending, he said softly, but not the one she imagined. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. Though Miss Brent now lay in a sedated state under close medical watch, Holmes remained uneasy. We had returned to Baker Street only a few hours before, but instead of retiring to rest, Holmes sat perched on the arm of the settee, cigarette smoke curling about him, like the fog thickening outside. The fire hissed softly as he stared, unspeaking, into the grate. Something is amiss, he murmured at last. I looked up from my notes. Miss Brent is in custody. The Temple is recovering. What more remains? Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood and crossed to the desk, retrieving a small folded square of paper, Brent's final letter. Though its contents had been deemed cryptic at best, Holmes had studied it obsessively. I had read it myself, and while it held a chilling sort of poetic finality, it did not seem to reveal anything of strategic import. In silence I found justice, but justice demands balance. The final weight will fall, and the echoes will know peace. She intended one last act, Holmes said quietly. Something symbolic, something irreversible. I frowned. But surely, at that moment, The door flew open and Inspector Lestrade entered, breathless. "Holmes!" he gasped. "There's been a break-in at the Royal Archives, at the theatre licensing office." Holmes turned sharply. "When?" "An hour ago. File stolen. The witness saw a woman, cloaked and limping, disappeared into the fog before pursuit could begin." Holmes's jaw tightened. "She has an accomplice." "Brent," I said, astonished. "But she's under guard." Holmes shook his head. "I examined her coat at the safe house. Fresh soil on the hem, different from the city dust. She met someone in the past 48 hours, a rendezvous outside London, likely her last instruction." Lestrade blinked. "Then who was the accomplice?" Holmes crossed to his bookshelves and pulled down a volume. Criminal Correspondence of the late 19th century. From the rear he extracted an old photograph. He handed it to me. The image showed Greaves, Haythorne, Radcliffe, and a fourth man, gaunt, spectacled, with narrow shoulders and a wary expression. In the margin, Holmes had written Henry Vale, former theatre clerk, disgraced 1878, forgery, extortion, released 1890. "Brent's brother," Holmes said simply. "She used her real surname once, in a hotel guest book in Dover, Eliza Vale." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You think he helped her plan the whole thing?" "No," Holmes replied. "I think he has yet to finish it." By midday, a disturbing pattern emerged. The licensing records taken pertained exclusively to productions involving Margot Temple from 15 years earlier. Specifically, the disputed performances that led to her public fall from grace. These were the same performances Greaves and Haythorne had reviewed and censured, fabricating charges of impropriety and sedition. "What does he want with old permits?" Lestrade asked. "Control of the narrative," Holmes said grimly. "Vale intends to destroy the original records and replace them with forgeries, documents that will retroactively rewrite Margot's story." I was stunned. "He wants to clear her name?" Holmes nodded. "Posthumously, if necessary. He believes Brent is dead or soon will be, and that his task is to finish her legacy, but there is a complication." He walked to the window and peered down onto Baker Street. "He will not do it quietly. Symbolism matters too much to them. I suspect he plans a fire." Lestrade swore under his breath. "The archives, if they go up, will lose a century of records." Holmes turned to us. "Then we must stop him before nightfall." The Royal Archives building in Whitehall loomed grey and silent as we approached that evening. Fog clung to its stone like damp wool. The constables posted outside had seen no sign of Vale, but Holmes's instincts urged otherwise. "I wager he's already inside," he said, and indeed the rear door bore signs of tampering. We crept in, our boots echoing along long, chilled corridors. The scent of paper and varnish hung thick in the air, until Holmes raised a hand. "Petrol," he whispered. We moved quickly now, descending into the lower chambers. The light was dim, but enough to reveal an unsettling sight. Several shelves cleared, boxes torn open, and in the centre, a man crouched beside a large crate. He was pouring liquid across files and floorboards. "Henry Vale," Holmes called. The man froze, then rose slowly. His face, pallid and narrow, bore no malice, only an eerie calm. "You're too late," he said softly. "There is still time," Holmes replied. "You don't have to finish this." "I do," Vale answered. "You wouldn't understand. They took her voice, they erased her. We are only restoring truth." "You're about to burn it," I said. He smiled sadly. "Only the lies." Holmes stepped forward. "You care for your sister. Then let her survive this with honour. A crime in her name is no tribute. It's a perversion." Vale hesitated, eyes flicking to the box of matches beside him. "She suffered for years, in silence. No applause, no justice. Just shadows and dust." Holmes's voice was low. "Then give her light. Let the truth be spoken, not torched." For a moment we saw the struggle behind Vale's eyes, the grief, the exhaustion. And then slowly he dropped the matchbox. Lestrade and I rushed forward, securing him as Holmes removed the petrol-soaked papers. It was done. As we emerged into the fog once more, Holmes exhaled slowly. "Fire demands fuel," he said, "but tonight we gave it only silence." Chapter 14. Holmes closes. In The Final Clue, revealed the events at the Royal Archives marked a turning point, not only in the unravelling of the case but in Holmes himself. The arrest of Henry Vale brought a close to the physical threat, yet Holmes remained unsettled. his thoughts drawn still deeper into the intangible layers of motive and orchestration. We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, Vale in custody and the purloined files secured. Lestrade was satisfied, convinced the affair had been stymied at last. But Holmes's expression betrayed no triumph. He refused supper, declined rest, and stood instead at the mantel, one hand pressed to his mouth in silent contemplation. "You're not convinced it's over," I observed. He shook his head. "It is not the acts of violence that concern me now, Watson, but the silence between them. What remains unspoken, unrevealed, something yet eludes me." I sat forward. Vale admitted everything. The plot to clear his sister's name, the archive fire. He even spoke of the original fraud against Margot Temple. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "and that is precisely what troubles me." He spoke too freely. Vale is a man of shadows. He survives through absence, not exposure. Yet he offered his confession like a monologue prepared. "You believe it? Rehearsed?" "I believe it incomplete." Holmes retrieved Brent's final letter from the desk drawer and unfolded it once more. His eyes scanned the lines with the same fervent scrutiny I had seen him give ancient ciphers and blood-spattered diaries. "In silence I found justice. The final weight will fall, and the echoes will know peace." Then, quite suddenly, he looked up, his gaze sharpened. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the theatre ledger we examined at Radcliffe's estate?" I nodded. "The one listing past productions, many of them Temple's early works. And did you notice the discrepancy?" I blinked. "What discrepancy?" Holmes strode to the bookshelf and pulled down a slim folio, his own copy of the Registry of London Performances, 1875–1885. He opened it and began scanning a page with exacting precision. Radcliffe's ledger listed The Silent Star as a performance in the winter of 1879, but this registry lists no such title, nor any licence play by that name. He turned the book toward me. The slot for that season was empty. "Then it was unlicensed?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. "Which is significant. Only two groups could benefit from fabricating a production, those who feared what was performed and those who wished to bury it." He crossed to the cabinet, opened a folder marked Temple Archive, and removed a photograph. A portrait of Margot Temple in character, elegant, veiled, eyes fixed with solemn fury upon the distance. "She performed it," he said softly. "They erased it." I frowned. But what was it about? Holmes placed the photograph under the light and adjusted the magnifier over her lapel. There, embroidered with fine thread, was a single symbol, a stylized pair of open hands holding a mirror. "I've seen this emblem before," he murmured. "It is the mark of the rites of allegory." My confusion must have shown plainly. He explained, "A secret society among London dramatists founded after the censorship acts of the 1850s. They met in private, staging unlicensed plays as moral protests, political, philosophical, dangerous work. Many were destroyed after performance to avoid arrest." He tapped the photo. Temple's The Silent Star was likely one of these, a performance held once, then vanquished from public record. "But why erase it?" I asked. "What did it reveal?" Holmes straightened. Perhaps it revealed too much. About the judges, about society, about Temple herself. If Radcliffe, Greaves and Haythorne conspired to fabricate a scandal, it may not have been to punish her, but to protect themselves. And Brent knew? Holmes nodded. She discovered it years later, likely when Vale found one of the scripts or correspondence. That was the deeper motive. Not revenge for a ruined career, but vengeance for a truth smothered. I sat back slowly. Then the murders, the attempted destruction of the archives. They were not merely acts of retribution, but of revelation. "Indeed," Holmes said, "each act Brent committed was meant to mirror the concealments of the past. Gunshots separated by silence, violence buffered by reflection, a reenactment of injustice." He folded the letter once more and placed it gently on the mantel. "It is a tragedy of symbols," he said quietly, "and of silence. Too many silences." At that moment, there came a knock upon the door. It was Lestrade, pale and drawn. "Holmes," he said, "it's Brent." We looked up sharply. "She's conscious." Holmes moved swiftly, coat already over his shoulders. "She asked for you by name," Lestrade added. "Said she would speak only to Sherlock Holmes." Holmes met my gaze. "Then the curtain is about to rise." and without another word we followed Lestrade into the night. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. Brent's hospital room was a hushed and sterile chamber at St. Bartholomew's, the gas lamps turned low and the curtains drawn. A faint scent of iodine and rosewater hung in the air. The woman lay propped against a stack of pillows, her complexion sallow, her hair loose and streaked with grey. Her left arm was bandaged, and a thin tube fed into her wrist, pulsing quietly with the rhythm of life renewed. She was awake when we entered, eyes open and alert, though dulled by fatigue and laudanum. Her voice was barely a whisper when she greeted us. "You came," she said, more a statement than a question. Holmes moved to the chair beside her, folded himself into it, and regarded her solemnly. "You asked for me," he replied. Brent smiled faintly. "Not because I expected forgiveness." "You were never mine to forgive," Holmes said, "but you have a story to finish." She gave a tired laugh. "Not finished? Begin." Watson and I remained quiet. Lestrade stood near the door, scribbling notes but refrained from interrupting. "Margot Temple," Brent began, "was the only person who ever saw through me, and still chose to trust me. When she was destroyed, I knew no loyalty could remain to those who had betrayed her. So I buried myself inside their world, serving it, knowing that I would one day bring it down." She turned her eyes to Holmes. "I didn't act out of grief. I acted out of devotion." "You discovered the truth of the scandal?" Holmes asked. Brent nodded. "Eventually. Vale had pieced it together first. He found one of Temple's letters to a friend, an actress who had performed in The Silent Star. The letter detailed how Radcliffe and Greaves demanded she cease writing for the rights of allegory. When she refused, they conspired with Haythorne to brand her mad and unfit for the stage. The forged contracts they exposed were props from her underground plays, scripts never meant for public eyes. And the affair with Radcliffe's wife? A fabrication, meant to erode her reputation. They destroyed her, and in doing so, killed more than her name. They buried a movement. Holmes folded his hands. "And so, you became her echo." Brent's lips twitched. It seemed only fair. If they had the gall to write about her downfall, I would write their judgment. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then let us write the ending, Miss Brent. The truth must be spoken, publicly, irrevocably. And I need your help." She blinked. "To what end?" "To restore her name, to expose the fraud, and to show London what silence costs." Brent's eyes moistened. She nodded. Later that day, Holmes summoned the major players to a private salon at the Royal Lyceum Theatre. It was an unusual venue for an investigation's conclusion, but Holmes insisted. "I want them surrounded by ghosts," he said. By late afternoon the room had filled. Inspector Lestrade stood to the side, notebook in hand. Lady Adeline Haythorne, veiled in mourning black, sat primly near the hearth, flanked by her husband's surviving brother. Lord Edward Radcliffe, pale but composed, leaned heavily on a cane. Judge Greaves's widow, Margaret Greaves, sat with gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Vale was present too, flanked by 2 constables. Though in custody, Holmes had requested he be brought. The man's eyes smouldered, but he held himself with the dignity of a priest at a funeral. I stood near the rear, recording the proceedings as always. Holmes entered last, calm and poised, as though stepping onto a familiar stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I have gathered you not as suspects nor as witnesses, but as audience. Tonight a performance long denied will resume." He laid Margot Temple's photograph on the table. This woman was accused, disgraced and forgotten. But what she uncovered, what she attempted to reveal, remains our concern today. A forged scandal, a false affair, the silencing of a playwright whose only crime was truth. Gasps rippled through the room. Lady Haythorne half rose, her lips trembling. Holmes continued undeterred. Her play, The Silent Star, was not mere fiction. It was an allegory of corruption. Your corruption. He looked pointedly at Radcliffe and the Greaves family. The reason it was destroyed was not that it slandered you, but that it named you, metaphorically of course, but too accurately. Greaves' widow whispered something inaudible. Holmes turned to Brent, now seated behind a curtain, her face unseen but her voice clearly audible, through a speaking tube Holmes had arranged. "I have with me a witness to history," he said, "one who saw it unfold. Miss Brent?" Her voice rang low and steady. I saw the original performance. I read Temple's letters. I preserved what remained. I watched the judges bury her, and I wrote the silence that followed. Holmes let the revelation settle like dust in the air. Tonight, the silence ends. He produced a bound manuscript from his coat, the final copy of the Silent Star, reconstructed from Brent's fragments and Temple's notes. I intend to see this performed, as it was meant to be. Radcliffe rose indignant. You'll ruin reputations with that slander. Holmes met his gaze. Reputations are already ruined, legacies built on ashes. And with that, he turned away, leaving the room silent but for the crackle of the gas lamps. We followed. Outside, the street was shrouded in mist, and Holmes, for once, allowed himself a breath of satisfaction. One more act to come, he said, and then the curtain may fall. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down The Lyceum Theatre stood quiet in the early evening haze. Holmes had arranged for one final audience in the drawing-room adjacent to the main stage. The gaslights flickered low, casting shadows along the red velvet drapes and gold-trimmed cornices. Present were the same figures from the day before: Radcliffe, Lady Haythorne, Margaret Greaves, Inspector Lestrade and Vale, brought again under supervision. This time Holmes stood at the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, as though delivering the final monologue of a long and tragic play. Watson and I watched from the corner, silent observers of what was to come. Holmes began without ceremony. Much has been obscured in this case, not only through deception but through omission. Tonight I shall make plain what has long remained hidden. He gestured to Vale first. This man, Nathaniel Vale, is no mere bitter dramatist, no lone zealot acting from personal grief. He is an archivist of truth. In his possession were copies of Temple's original scripts, personal correspondences, and most importantly, an annotated version of the Silent Star, one that drew direct parallels between the fictional Council of Elders and the actual members of a secretive review board in 1891. At this, Margaret Greaves let out a sharp intake of breath. Her fingers clutched the armrest of her chair. Holmes continued. Judge Greaves, Lord Radcliffe, and Jonathan Haythorne were all members of that board. In that capacity they reviewed controversial artistic works and decided which could be publicly performed. In theory, their purpose was to protect moral standards. In truth, they used their positions to silence dissenting voices, especially those that criticised the judiciary, political corruption, and patriarchal privilege. Holmes lifted a paper from his pocket. This is a letter from Margot Temple to a confidant, dated just weeks before her public scandal. In it, she outlines how the board issued warnings about the Silent Star, how Greaves threatened to revoke the theatre's licence if it was staged. Lady Haythorne rose. You cannot prove— I can, Lady Haythorne, Holmes said sharply, because you wrote to the very same confidant asking her to convince Temple to abandon the play. Your handwriting matches, the ink, the paper, even the watermark from your personal stationery. The lady sat down, visibly shaken. Temple refused. The performance went ahead, and within a fortnight she was accused of falsifying contracts and seducing a married nobleman, Radcliffe. Radcliffe stood abruptly. That accusation came from the press. The press, Holmes said, which received anonymous tips and forged documents. Documents planted by Haythorne, Greaves and yourself. Radcliffe's face reddened. Holmes went on. Now here is where the gunshots come in. On the night of Vale's anonymous reading of the Silent Star, shots were fired backstage, first to draw attention, the second to silence Brent, who had discovered something she was not meant to see. Lestrade interjected. And what was that? Holmes turned to him. A page, torn from Temple's original script, hidden beneath the floorboards of the Lyceum. It was Brent who found it just before the second gunshot. He produced a small, crumpled parchment. This page was Temple's last edition, a thinly veiled accusation naming the 3 musks of the law cloaked in powdered wigs who dine on silence and rule by omission. It was poetic, but unmistakable. Watson leaned toward me. A confession, buried in metaphor. Holmes nodded, then turned to Vale. Brent passed this page to Vale just before she collapsed. He fled, fearing he'd be accused of attempted murder. But he held the truth and used it to complete the manuscript. That's what he was delivering to the editor at the Chronicle when he was arrested. Vale looked down, saying nothing, but his shoulders seemed lighter. Holmes concluded. Brent's plan had always been to reconstruct Temple's legacy. She staged the anonymous reading to test the waters, to see if London could still hear the truth. She knew the risk. The silence between the two gunshots was the breath before revelation. Margaret Greaves suddenly rose. "You speak as though my husband were a villain. He served justice." Holmes looked at her without malice. He served it selectively. He silenced one woman to protect his own. No one spoke for several moments. Then Lestrade cleared his throat. "And what do you propose, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes walked to the table and set down the manuscript. "The full truth must be printed, publicly, with Brent's statement, Vale's documents, and Temple's letters. Let the people decide. Let the theatre reopen with the Silent Star in its proper place." Radcliffe scoffed. "You think the press will embrace a ghost?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "They embrace less every day." Outside the theatre, the wind had risen, rattling the shutters like an unseen audience applauding the curtain's fall. Brent's voice had vanished now. She slept deeply, watched over by a nurse who knew only half, the tale. But her story, Temple's story, was no longer buried. And as Holmes lit a final match to seal the wax on his package for the editor, he looked to me and said softly, "It was never about the gunshots, Watson. It was always about the silence in between." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days following Holmes' revelation at the Lyceum moved with the quiet gravity of an approaching storm. No one leapt into the streets proclaiming truth. No trumpets heralded the vindication of Margot Temple. And yet, within certain circles, editors, barristers, political playwrights, a shift began. Holmes' carefully prepared manuscript, along with Vale's annotated copy of the Silent Star and the letters of both Brent and Temple, were delivered under secure seal to the offices of the Chronicle. Its editor, a cautious man with an eye for public appetite, hesitated only long enough to verify the documents. Within 48 hours, the front page bore a bold headline, "The Voice That Was Silenced, The Hidden Life and Death of Margot Temple." Watson and I read the paper over tea at Baker Street that morning. Holmes had not yet risen, having spent the prior evening pacing until nearly dawn. The article was thorough and respectful, balancing the tragic demise of Temple with the long-suppressed truths she had sought to tell. It included facsimiles of her handwritten script pages, a carefully redacted excerpt of the council's minutes, and even a postscript from Brent herself, though her handwriting was frail, and the words dictated from her hospital bed. Scotland Yard, inevitably, reacted with great caution. Inspector Lestrade, though not unsympathetic, made no move to arrest Radcliffe or Haythorne. Greaves, of course, was long deceased, and as Holmes had predicted, the Yard chose the safest path. No charges, no scandal, no court case, just a change in the air. It was in the theatre that the truest reckoning occurred. A week after the publication, the Lyceum's board, under pressure from public sentiment and in the wake of a private yet firm conversation with Holmes, voted unanimously to revive the Silent Star. Vale, reluctantly, agreed to oversee the restoration of the script. Brent, still too weak to attend rehearsals, had a small brass plaque mounted backstage, dedicating the performance to Temple's memory. I remember standing beside Holmes just inside the theatre doors on the opening night of the revival. The room was packed. No one knew whether to expect a sermon, a scandal, or salvation. The curtain lifted, and the first words echoed through the hall, Temple's words, rich and fearless. After the performance, a brief reception was held. Critics, socialites, and a few bold politicians murmured praise over champagne. Holmes stood apart from them all, leaning against a pillar with an unreadable expression. Lady Haythorne, to her credit, made no public appearance. Her name remained absent from the Chronicle's piece, though the implications were clear to anyone who knew the players. Lord Radcliffe, however, could not resist. He arrived halfway through the reception, flanked by two society men, his face pale but proud. The applause quieted slightly as he entered, but no one approached him. Holmes merely glanced his way once, then returned to examining the fresco above the bar. "I imagine," I whispered to Holmes, "that a man like Radcliffe will suffer more from exclusion than exposure." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Justice is not always a gavel and iron bars, Watson. Sometimes it's silence, not the forced kind, the kind people choose." As we made our way out into the night, the theatre still glowing behind us, I asked Holmes whether he considered this case a victory. He paused. "A woman was buried twice, once by death, once by silence. That silence has been broken. A voice has returned. If that is not justice, then it is, at the very least, an answer. He turned his coat collar up against the wind and strode off down the street, leaving me to catch up in my usual breathless way. We passed the lamplighter as he made his rounds, the flame trembling into life against the early fog. For a moment I imagined Margot Temple walking those same cobbles, script clutched under arm, fire in her eyes. She had not lived to see her story told. But thanks to Holmes, stoic, brilliant Holmes, her silence had found its end, and in that ending something began anew. Chapter 18. Holmes. Final reflection. The last embers of the case burned slowly, like a fire left to gutter beneath a still hearth. London had moved on, as it always does. The Chronicle had taken up a new scandal involving the Royal Mint, and the Lyceum, while still drawing respectable crowds, no longer carried the air of provocation it had that opening night. And so it was that Holmes and I returned to our familiar rhythms at Baker Street. A few weeks had passed when I found him, one grey morning in his chair, legs crossed, violin across his knee. He had not played it, merely held it there like one might a letter never sent. The fire was low. Outside, the winter mist clung to the panes like breath. "You've been very quiet," I said. "I'm tired, Watson," Holmes replied, not lifting his gaze. "Not in body, but in thought. The sort of fatigue that follows a long association with deceit." I sat across from him, watching the way his fingers tapped absently against the scroll of the violin. It was a rare thing for Holmes to admit to weariness, and rarer still to reflect on the emotional toll of a case. Was it the nature of the crime, I asked? The concealment of a murder, or the motives behind it? He finally looked up at me. "No, Watson. It was not the crime itself that unsettled me, nor even the murder. It was that for once our adversary was not driven by greed, or passion, or desperation, but by something cold, institutional self-preservation, the sort of fear that wears a waistcoat and signs its name in ink." He rose then, moving to the window and pushing it open despite the cold. A gust of chill air entered, stirring the papers on the desk. The city beyond was still waking, carriages rolling, a newsboy shouting, bells ringing faintly from St. James. "I have seen men kill to protect fortune," Holmes continued, "and women kill to protect their children. But here the truth was suffocated not by a single hand but by many, each convinced they were doing no harm, merely preserving order, decorum, respectability." "You speak of the council," I asked. "I speak of everyone who knew and said nothing, everyone who benefited, everyone who feared being tainted by truth. Even Brent in her silence gave cover to injustice." "And yet," I said gently, "you still crack the case." Margot Temple's voice was heard. "Isn't that victory?" He gave a slight shake of the head. "It is something, but not victory." There was a long pause. Then Holmes said, almost absently, "Do you recall the phrase carved into Temple's dressing-room mirror?" "2 gunshots and not a soul heard them," I recited. "You said it was the key." It was, but not merely for its metaphorical resonance. The killer fired 2 shots, one real, one staged, and counted on silence to disguise them. But the true crime was not in the gunpowder, it was in what followed. The silence, Watson. The silence of those who knew. He turned back to me, expression unreadable. "I once believed deduction to be the highest pursuit of the mind. That truth, revealed through reason, was an end in itself. But this case has taught me otherwise." He crossed to the mantel, picked up his pipe, and began packing it with methodical care. "Truth," he said slowly, "requires more than logic to endure. It must be spoken. It must be heard." I let the words settle. It struck me then that Holmes, this man so dedicated to facts and sequences, had found himself tangled in something less tidy, something emotional, something human. He lit the pipe. The smoke curled upward like a thought escaping into the ether. "You've done good, Holmes," I said finally. He inclined his head, almost absently. "I did what I could," he replied. "But let us not pretend that justice always comes at the clang of a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in quieter forms, a play revived, a plaque mounted, a name remembered. Small things, perhaps, but not nothing." There was a knock at the door just then. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a small envelope. "It's from Miss Brent," she said, placing it on the tray. Holmes opened it with no haste. Inside was a card, a single sentence in Brent's trembling hand. She would have thanked you, Mr. Holmes, though perhaps not gently. A rare smile touched Holmes's lips. I shall consider that my commendation, he murmured. We sat in silence after that, the kind that asks for no interruption. Holmes smoked. I sipped my tea, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, London moved on, heedless and eternal, but somewhere in the fog the echo of 2 gunshots remained, followed, at long last, by the breaking of silence.